Hello and welcome to the culminating conversation with Ather Zia, who took over the Conflictorium Instagram handle this weekend. I'm just quickly waiting for Ather to join.
Hi, Avni.
Hello. It's so good to finally talk to
Yeah,
you
same here.
after having followed your work and appreciated it
Thank you.
for so long.
And same here. Same goes for me to you and your work. Thank you so much for being such a great ally and showing so much solidarity.
I want to really first thank you for bringing so many voices that you did bring to this takeover along with yours. And in some senses, to be sitting in India here and just hearing the voices that has been primarily they've been shut out, that that connection, that of being able to think of a people, an entire people as human, has been made impossible by the state. And so it's really in connections like these, in between people, that even becomes sort of possible in our imaginations, I
Yeah.
think.
I am
But
not, I
yeah,
can't believe that someone in India is speaking like this still. It's very hard. Not that I don't have friends. I have some really great allies who, despite being patriots, know what's happening in Kashmir, do not hesitate to speak for whatever they can. But at the same time, it's very hard at this particular moment. As when I'm speaking to you at the moment, Kashmiris back home, they're very, very scared because there's many number of buses, countless buses going inside during the COVID lockdown. They're going inside Kashmir at the moment, and the passengers mostly are men, and people are getting different kind of explanations of why they're going there. Some are saying that they're going to study computer programming. That's what some people have been responded with. And some people think that, and I think there are many explanations over the fact that these are just construction, these are laborers who are going to be working in the brick kilns. They're not COVID tested. And why is it that so many people at this moment, these workers are being transported into Kashmir? And you can see videos, and you can see just civilian journalists, just regular people who are watching these buses go by, and no one is offering any explanation. There are trains, special trains that are going in, and this is not the pilgrimage, this is something separate. So all of these speculations, as you and I are talking here, these speculations are going back home, and they don't know August 5th just happened last year, and those memories are still very, very raw, and people are vulnerable, and they're feeling humiliated, and they're also feeling robbed. I mean, that's what the takeover, I felt like those were the voices that we needed to bring during the takeover, and especially for the Indian audience. I feel at some point people who really should be knowing what's happening in Kashmir more than the international audiences is the Indian people. And
yeah,
despite
yeah,
patriotism, despite lazy nationalism, I think it's very
right,
important for people to know what's happening, even if they choose to unsee it.
right, yeah, yeah, because it is ultimately in the name of these very people um, that all this violence is unfolding, in the name of um, this Indian um, uh, citizenry that is being constructed every day by othering Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we are at a stage where um, even as earlier one would talk about the state as if it was separate from its people's desires, that it had a mind of its own and it did something with power. But we are at a fairly strange junction where a lot of people's voices and where they stand and what they want is being represented by the state.
Mm-hmm.
And so that comfortable distinction that a lot of us have made over years and years, that with the people don't wish this,
Mm-hmm.
it's the state. Those distinctions are actually falling apart, uh, which is actually more difficult to accept. Uh,
Yeah, it's
that we are, yeah.
yeah, that there's no difference between, we used to, there was this time when people used to think about the Indian government and the Indian people. And then, slowly those layers were peeled off. And, Kashmir was open to people from India. Kashmir was always open to business people. Many people after August 5th started thinking about they can go to Kashmir, they can buy land, they can buy property. But the fact is that Indians and people from all over the world already had businesses in Kashmir. They were already leasing properties. They were already leasing lands to the tune of 99 years, because that was
Yeah.
what was prevalent, and even going beyond that, centuries. So they were already there. But what actually happened
Yeah.
after August 5th is that all the layers were peeled, all the veils were taken away, and what Kashmiris saw was rank nationalism. They came face to face with a rank nationalism, with a lazy nationalism. Just thinking about the fact that one of the state I think he's just a politician. I don't know if he holds an office, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the news when they said that now you can go marry fair Kashmiri girls, and that really led to a backlash actually in the real world. It wasn't just a rally, it was actually the people and women across India, especially in Delhi, I think, who really faced a lot of racism, who really faced a lot of misogyny based on that. And that kind of leads you to think, like, what is the difference between where is the state and where are the people, like, and these are the moments. August 5th was a juncture where everything was you kind of really began to realize that there was no difference, that nationalism, lazy nationalism, so to speak, rank nationalism had really taken over the people. And for Kashmiris, suddenly, we as scholars, as activists, as just regular civilians, we have been very, very careful in trying to say that this is the government, this is the state, and then there are the masses. But Kashmiris,
Yeah.
time and again, there have been junctures where there has been no difference. Thinking about just hanging a Kashmiri on circumstantial evidence, and then the Supreme Court saying that this is the case of Afzal Guru, saying that this is for the collective conscience. Like, how you can actually hang a person for the collective conscience of the entire nation, and people were quiet, because what's been done in othering Kashmiris is that the state has told them that this is the enemy, especially a Kashmiri Muslim man is the enemy. And the Kashmiri Muslim woman, of course, is the enemy, but then she's also othered in a different way, because she's kind of shown as she's the victim of this man and we will save her in some ways and in many ways. And then also there is sympathy of some sort if she kind of comes to our side, but if she's there, then we don't have any sympathy. And that has time and again been proven in cases like mass rape cases, Kanan Poshpora 1991. People, I don't think that there are Indian allies who have talked about it, but also still not really going towards the army and saying that this is what's wrong inside Kashmir. The AFSPA is wrong. The entire legal, what over the years, over the last 72 years, the juridical annexation that has happened of Kashmir, first directly by military aggression. and when I say lazy nationalism, the reason I call it lazy nationalism is because people haven't taken, especially Indian people, I think in the last 33 years, they should have taken some time out to see why Kashmiris are doing what they're doing. You can't just lump a people as a proxy war. You can't just lump a people as terrorists and then kind of, give dog a bad name and shoot him. That's not what you do. And the reason I call it lazy nationalism, and I feel like we should be categorizing it as such, is because they don't take the time. And it's not, it's not harming. And for lack of a better phrase, there have been many instances where people have pointed out, many scholars and allies and activists, that Kashmir will be an undoing for India. And that's what we see happening. Now, what was unfolding in Kashmir is slowly unfolding in the rest of the parts of, the region, especially. So, yeah, I think we are at the juncture where there is almost, when I'm talking to you, I know I'm talking to an Indian, and I know that you're an ally, and I know that, when I did the takeover, I was like, what can I do with this? Because Kashmiris have been silenced at the moment. They're not silent, they've been silenced. And I thought that, the best thing, which would also be service to your audience, would be telling them what Kashmiris actually think. What do they think of themselves as Kashmiri? It's not as if Pakistanis are telling us to think of this way about yourself, but they are thinking in a certain way. And then as I asked people, I said, can you contribute to this? And many of you'll see there's a similarity in what they say, because the sensoriality of the siege, the sensoriality of the occupation, and when I say occupation, I really want the Indian masses and audiences, whoever is watching this or will watch this in future, I do want them to kind of engage with the word occupation. And also try not to think that it makes you any less, because you haven't been told this word in its rank manifestation. What you've been told is a narrative, a nationalist narrative, that Indian Army went to save Kashmir in 1947. But no one has really asked majority of Kashmiris, what do you think of Indian Army? And I think there's a disconnect there. People tell themselves stories, and historians, the Indian narrative, the Indian policy has sold its people a story. And that's the bedtime story that everyone is continuing to tell each other, despite the fact that even the most sympathetic of client politicians who sided with India are kind of, right, where have we thrown our lot at this particular moment? So I think we're at a crucial juncture. It's a very dangerous juncture, because the other word that I want to throw in this conversation is settler colonialism. And maybe, start thinking about Palestine, like the Palestine situation, how a friend of mine once told me that Kashmir is a Palestine no one talks about. This was a decade back. And I make mention of it in several of my writings, because I feel like that is something that, because India, previously, despite many misgivings, was an ally to Palestinian people. And but at the same time, they do not see Kashmiri suffering in the same way, because they think, everyone thinks that they're the best, and they know the best for these other people. And that was what actually was sold to Indian people on August 5th. That patina of using the word development, that we will develop Kashmiris, despite India's own analysts talking about how developed Kashmir was than the states of India, giving them the development indices that were really encouraging or were going up. And saying, and then there were some strawman arguments, and then there were really big lies that the government was actually telling people, and people were buying it like anything. And then the same thing was sold to the international community. And I feel like that's something that we really, really need to keep a spotlight on as Kashmiri scholars, as Kashmiri people. But at the same time, Indians do have to start thinking in terms of what international community thinks of them, because international community for the last 72 years, there was a phase of Cold War, and then there was an era of like this stringent rank neoliberalization that is still very strong. that people were ready to unsee a lot of things. But I see the tide turning as well, because it might take a long time, but indigenous people are coming together, whether they're coming together wittingly or unwittingly, but we are hearing the same conversations. The same conversation is happening in Ecuador. The same conversation is happening here at Standing Rock. The same conversation is happening in Palestine, of course. Same conversation is happening when we think about Rohingyas in Myanmar, and thinking about indigeneity. Like, these are people who are natives, or even if they have come from somewhere else but have been in this place for the longest possible time. In the same way, we have to think about Kashmiri indigeneity. And I'm not making indigeneity exclusive. I'm an anthropologist. I think in terms of peoples. But at the same time, we have to think about indigenous rights. We have to think about who are these people who at this moment are seeking to be the domicile of Kashmir. Who are these people? Like, this is a place where every day there are funerals. People are being killed. People are being blinded. And who are these people who want to go and live in Kashmir? Who are these people who are going to the government and saying, I'm going to go from Bihar and stay in Kashmir? And that's what's happening in the past 2-3 months, ever since the domicile amendment came into effect. And people started, we started having these news come around where an officer is saying that he's going to acquire the domicile status of Kashmir. And my question is that when someone comes, when people don't want you to come in, when people are completely against, and that's what Kashmiris are. Kashmiris, they're not against people coming in and doing business, but when you think about your sovereignty, no one really thinks about Kashmiri sovereignty, and that's what 35A was. It was to protect Kashmir's territorial sovereignty, and no one is thinking of Kashmiris as peoples. Maybe the people who are currently watching news, imbibing news, their grandfathers, their grandmothers, they kind of knew Kashmir in that. But what has been sold in the past 72 years is completely different. It's almost like this is Pakistan's proxy war. And I think that is an insult to Kashmiris. Thinking in terms of terrorism, because the world can easily see that shorthand after 2001, I feel that's not only an insult to us, that's also an insult to someone who sold that in a very shorthand manner. And I think this is an affront to Indian people as well. And that's something that should become a conversation, like thinking of Kashmir in terms of occupation, thinking of Kashmir in terms of settler colonialism, thinking of Kashmir in terms of neo-colonial, neo-imperialistic designs that India has on this region. And that we have seen after August 5th, not that it wasn't happening before, but after August 5th, it's like rank resource extraction. Shutting people inside the homes, not listening to them at all, and saying that we're going to take your sand, now we're going to take your minerals, now we're going to build roads and connect, and you're going to be no part of this. Now we're going to change your domicile status. Now we're going to change your water department. And we're going to change names and make them in Hindi. So taking away your language, what does that say? I mean, all of these things, what do they say? Like, if you were to brutalize an already brutalized person and beat them with all of these sticks, you are not just creating an other, you're really, really sharpening whatever resistance that they have. And it's so yeah, I'll stop there. I know I can go on and on about this.
You put the word out there. You said it for what it is. It's an occupation. And I wonder sometimes whether Indian people also realize of what kind of an internal occupation we are facing as well simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
So while in the name of a patriotism, the state goes there and brutalizes people, it's also simultaneously brutalizing internally.
Mm-hmm.
Very often, the Indian independence is marked at 1947, but I really wonder whether we've stopped meaning when we say Indian independence from the British happened in 1947, but India is very, very much still internally colonized by a brutal, brutal caste system, which keeps things sort of in a kind of status quo in uh, and as a people, we as Indian people, we are not even seeing this internal colonialism. So I think over the years, over the last 70, 80 years, in small doses, whether through media narratives or state narratives, or whether through our textbooks, we have slowly been sort of been really given this slow poison of not being able to critically see our own moment or our own condition. Um, and so I sometimes feel like how how uh, how much blindness do we actually hold in us to then not even be able to see the blindness, to see a kind of real blindness that the government is going and imposing in Kashmir.
I think I think caste and religion are so intertwined that for the longest time people just didn't even realize. Like as a Kashmiri, when I was growing up, and I had friends who were from Delhi, or they were, and also like when I became a journalist before this life, and I had journalist friends, I did not realize at that moment, and even after coming to US and being part of US academia, the people that I was meeting, I hadn't really paid attention to the caste issue, and the people who I was connected to as Indians, be they friends or be they colleagues. I was, so here when you are in the Western academia, and it's kind of going away for the last 5-6 years, but there was this idea of the subaltern, and the brownness, the brown Indian colonized body was the subaltern body. And there was this famous quote, "Can the subaltern speak?"
Yeah.
And then there were layers within it. And when you came to the US academia, or maybe just let's lump it as Western academia, there was this idea that colonized brown people, no voice, and many of them are still, and many of them were very big names in academia. But then the idea was, to me, I also was not seeing the caste. Like, who are these people? Who are these Indians that are actually representative of what's happening here regarding all the scholarship that's being produced? And slowly it's kind of started dawning as Dalit scholars kind of got strength, and they have been very vocal inside India. There have been movements, and there's a movement here as well. Suddenly you realize that the privilege that many Indians who had privilege, who had caste privilege back in India, are the ones who kind of rose up to the top here, and that's what we see all across. And suddenly it also sort of started dawning on us, like, who are these people that you're talking to, and are we on the same page in the manner when we look at caste? And it's not as if Kashmiri society is not ridden with caste issues, even though it's a Muslim society, but all societies have some sort of caste meld, and Kashmiris have a caste issue as well, so to speak, like what type of indigeneity or what type of ancestry you have. So those issues are there, and they might not be as stringent, they might not be as visceral and ingrained, but they are as impactful on the society, and there are categories of people. So at the same time, so the reason I kind of bring this up is that in me, in the last 15 years, this realization has kind of become very strong slowly. What kind of person is sort of talking to me, like what kind of caste? Because that's also one of the biggest it's very important, like who's speaking for you. Then also when we lump the idea of the Indian liberals who are speaking for Kashmir at some point, and like what kind of speak is that? Is that for independence? Is that for just human rights violations? So those questions are arising, and I think many people are trying to answer them as scholars and activists here as well, and addressing caste issues and addressing the infrastructure and the systemic violence of caste. At the same time, the other awareness also being Muslim. So Kashmir issue, if we kind of see it in context of what BJP is brazenly doing, and I'm not saying, and I'm kind of saying what BJP did after August 5th or 2014 is what was already put into motion in 1947 by Jawaharlal Nehru himself, that there is going to be an erosion of this autonomy, that these people are one day going to kind of come to us, you know, they'll just be, this is just a matter of time. Even if it takes 72 years, they're going to, which never happened. Kashmiris never willingly did that, but Kashmir was always a Muslim issue. Even if we think about the kosher explanations of why Kashmir, it's like, oh, this is the biggest Muslim majority state. It kind of lends to the idea of pluralism of India. So even that kind of otherizes Kashmir. It might be a positive spin to India's own what it thinks, but at the same time, it also otherizes Kashmir. So if we think about what's happening at this particular moment with Kashmir, is there is this overarching rubric of Islamophobia, for lack of a better word, but this Muslim hatred that is brimming in India at the moment, and we see that unfolding in many ways. I don't have to tell you that, and I mean your audiences know better than what I know from here. So there is that larger narrative, and that's what Kashmiris are also facing, that this is going to be something that changes the demographics after August 5th, with the territorial sovereignty gone. And I do want the people who follow Conflictorium or who are going to follow this conversation at some point, I do want them to think about the fact that Kashmir had territorial sovereignty. Really sit with that word, engage with that word. What does 35A signify? Because Kashmir, for all its misgivings of the British Empire, this region coming together as an autonomous unit, for them to be different cultures and different people to be together, like a Ladakh on one side, Jammu on one side, and Kashmir on one side, and then you have Gilgit and Baltistan, and then you have the other side, which is now across the LOC at the moment. So you see all of these people together for whatever, like many people are like, this was put together by the British, this is not a country. Then India was put together by the British as well, that this shouldn't be your country. Sure. All states and all nation states have been put together at some point, different people mushed together. If India's diversity, if India's unity, is it in its diversity? Why is diversity in Kashmir not for its unity? Why is it seen as a lesser strength? Is it because you have a bigger nation state saying, oh, I can take care of you people, you know, you're small entities, let me. But I think, so people have to sit with the idea of territorial sovereignty. What is it that I do not believe in the accession? Because that accession in 1947 was done by a section of people who were already pro-India and who were not representing the majority at the moment. And many Indians, when they think about Article 370, they think it was temporary, but they also have to think about where did it really come from? Article 370, the fleeing Maharaja, when he was leaving Kashmir, he was running away, he was leaving his kingdom behind in the hands of who should be outrightly called client politician, not the leader of the masses at that moment. He was leader of a section of people who were in Srinagar at that moment, the capital of Kashmir. And he was who was in conversation with Jawaharlal Nehru. They were great friends. So when Maharaja was fleeing, they actually had a clause in there that this is going to be a temporary thing. We are only handing over these three things. And this was a fleeing Maharaja. How can one person decide the fate of the entire nation? And also, I think the independence, not the independence, but the emergency situation at the moment, he did not have the right to do that. And the reason was that one side of Kashmir had already liberated itself. When you think about Azad Kashmir, you also have to start thinking about why did these people call themselves Azad Kashmir? It was not Pakistan calling them Azad Kashmir. It was the fighters who had fought the Maharaja at that moment. And that's also when we think about Indian aggression, which has not been made into aggression in the Indian narrative. Indian people have been told we just went to save Kashmiris at that moment against the Pakistanis and the Kabilis. But that history has been rethought and that has been revised by Kashmiris themselves in the last 72 years, which was not read, but in the last 15 years in English language, and those books are around. And I feel like there are reading lists around that people should be taking advantage of and reading those books, and PDFs are around telling you what happened in 1947. But let's not think about history only, because things change. But if we look at the sensoriality of what has happened in the last 33 years actively, but also in the last 72 years, the brutalization, the demonization of Kashmiri people, the turning their land into this prison, almost like Gaza, and in some cases even worse, because it's not been seen as an occupation, not by the people, and also the entire world thinks that India is the largest democracy in South Asia, and that's what it is inside there. We also have to think about the voting, the electoral politics that is done inside Kashmir. That's based on illicit foundations. And United Nations categorically tells India in 1950s, when the first election was done, just for this piece of land, which was under Indian occupation at the moment, not for across the LOC, but they did consider that as well, and kind of like set up seats and constituencies for that part as well. UN tells India at that moment that this is out of order. You can't do this. This is a disputed region. You can't hold elections. And India at that moment, because it had already started its integrationist policies, kind of put it into motion. And Kashmiris have always looked at electoral politics as a mode of governance, and that is also in the international law, that if you are governing a certain region, administering a certain disputed region, you have to hold elections because you have to govern the place, even if you're holding onto it not legally. So when people think that Kashmiris are voting, it's the Indian government sells is that this is an endorsement of the Indian government, but that's not what Kashmiris think. Kashmiris have a very they have a categoric policy of the politics of azadi and politics of governance, and that narrative, the politics of governance, what I like to think of as politics of democracy, that we have voting, this is democracy, but that's not what's been happening in Kashmir for the last 72 years. India also preferred its fundamental rights into Kashmir in the 1950s, I think 54. And Indian Fundamental Rights Charter is very unique because it also has a provision for administrative detention. So you can detain people if they're threatening India's sovereignty. So when you give that to Kashmiris, because you've already had this accord with them through the client politicians, you're actually sending a Trojan horse inside Kashmir. And then what happens is that since the 1950s, Kashmiris have been mass detained here and there by their own client politicians who were Kashmiris, stooges, virtual puppets of Indian government, and criminalizing the politics of azadi, criminalizing politics of plebiscite, and trying to pare it down to what it has become after August 5th, which is just a colony of India. And there's no other way to describe it, just as a colony. The laws that are coming in, I was talking to one of my journalist friends yesterday. Her name is Anuradha Bhasin. She is the executive editor of Kashmir Times. And I was asking her about some situation, and she said, it's very hard to keep up. We don't really know. I'm not giving her away. She's already on record saying these things. And this was an interview we're doing, and which is going to be public very soon. And she said, I can't really keep up, because every day the laws are being changed so much. Yeah. There's a change to this, there's a change to that, and they are making this at breakneck speed, while the line of actual control, what's happening with China, and the LOC is also aflame, and the killings are going on in Kashmir. There are encounters, houses are being burned, COVID lockdown is being used as a weapon. keeping people inside while bringing masses of construction workers into Kashmir without any testing. So we don't know what's happening. And not only her, but if you look at Kashmir social media, whatever they're trying to run at 2G speed, seriously, like this is like the height of ingenuity that Kashmiris are showing. But when you read the Twitter, my heart sinks at every tweet, because they are worried at the moment. They don't know what's happening, and there's no other way. If you can use the phrase slow genocide, you can use the phrase incremental genocide, and it really fits. And then when you think about what incremental and slow genocide is, that is genocide. You are killing a people. You're killing a people that you think of as a Muslim body. You are killing a people that you think is not you. You are killing a people that you think that their land is more important, because extraction, resource extraction is what we see for the past 1 year, brazenly in the face of Kashmiris. And I think they are facing annihilation at the moment, and they are very, very scared. And Indian masses really need to not think of Kashmiris as these terrorists who are threatening their country, but they really need to see how they have threatened their country since the last 72 years, and how whatever modicum Kashmiris were not sold to 370 as a matter of loyalty. They were not sold to 35A as a matter of loyalty. They looked at it as a protection from demographic onslaught, because that has what has been the ultimate focus of the Indian government. It might not, people might not see it that way as their mandate, but that is the mandate that people give if they show so much silence. That is the mandate that they give their government to do. And it is being, as you said earlier, it is being done in their name. And I think it's not fair to anyone. It's not fair to Kashmiris, but it's also not fair to Indians. And I just wish that they go beyond the shorthand of proxy war, internal problem, law and order situation, and terrorism. They have to look at it historically. They cannot, and if they want their country, because I feel like the desolation that Kashmir has been made into, it's also a hint of things to come for India. So if they want their country to be healthy, they want their country to be one whole, they have to look at Kashmir. They have to take these people seriously, rather than think that it's someone instigating them. That's not the case. Kashmiris are not the kids of these two divorced parents, India and Pakistan. That's not the situation.
Yeah. You know, there's something that you brought up, which is the case of language, and I know from my visits to Kashmir that often friendships or trusts or even sort of just acquaintances are formed based on what kind of language one chooses to utter Kashmir with. And so back in India, people, just through how they refer to Kashmir, one can distill where they stand on the line, whether they are calling it the Kashmir problem or the Kashmir conflict or the dispute or the independence struggle. Especially over the last few months post 5th of August, it has been a sort of really a barrage of shaping our language here, of how are we are being given dictums on how are we allowed to speak and what kind of language is accessible to us. I have recently heard that a professor in a college was taking a course on and talking about Kashmir, and she called it out as an Indian occupation of Kashmir, and a student went ahead and I think filed a case on the teacher for having uttered this word, Indian occupied Kashmir, which really, for me, that is the larger design being distilled and now being automated is that the state had a plan and it's now being implemented through the last person, like the student, who we imagine as those that resist designs, those who find inroads through designs, and they themselves are beginning to be part of that project. It really, I think we are treading a really dangerous, meaning a heightened, meaning it was always a dangerous road that India took, but I think that is really heightened, that sense of who is now implementing that territorial kind of an imagination that land and territory is what makes a nation. You know?
Yeah, I do feel like, thinking about the student, I feel like we also have to look at the fear that has been created in Indian people's minds. I feel like it's a fearful population at the moment, especially the Hindu majority in India. I feel that for the past 72 years, a slow narrative, not the slow, it was kind of like in bits and spurts it would come, but a narrative has been built around the Muslim minority, that these are people who are damaging, they're vicious, they're demonized to a large extent. And Kashmir is also part of that narrative. Not the same problem. Indian Muslims are a different problem than what Kashmir is, but the Muslim rubric is there. And I feel that when you create so much fear, even an ordinary civilian who has no other problems but just to, just earn their daily bread, go home and just be, with the family, and has no sort of outward stake in politics or doing politics or the state. So I feel like when you create fear in people's minds, they take it upon themselves. When we see the lynchings happening, it's not there have been politicians as well, and, small time opinion leaders as well who have done the lynchings, but mostly it is just regular people who turn into this vigilante crowd because they have been mobilized to that point. And that's very, very, that's scary. And I think India is at that moment in this current moment. All of them, many of the masses have been mobilized. They have been, because there's been so much fear that has been put into them about everything. I think when looking at Afzal Guru's case, for the 10 years he was in jail, for the decade when he was basically in a media trial rather than anything else. You can kind of see how he was demonized, and how there was only one picture of his that was used in the entire decade, I think. And I've written about this, that the reason I kind of bring Afzal Guru, because I feel like it is such an important case for Indians to look at, or how they treat Kashmiris and how they treat their struggle, and also how they treat their day-to-day. Because Afzal Guru's case it's a case study in how what Kashmiris want, because he wanted Kashmir's self-determination at one point in time, then gave that struggle up. But when he comes back, he cannot escape the counter-insurgency grid inside Kashmir, who use him to do various things, because he cannot be a normal human being anymore, because the state has marked him as a surrendered militant. And that one decade when he's in the jail, initially when he's apprehended and he's in the detention, he's wearing a shirt and just regular trousers and a shirt, and he has glasses on. That picture, we don't see that picture anymore after the initial days. But what do you see afterwards is him wearing a kurta pajama with a kafaya on and beard, and that's the Muslim terrorist that Indians have in mind. So the reason I bring him up, and the reason I bring this image up, is because everyone who speaks for Kashmir, the kind of work I do, very recently there was this article that was against many Kashmiri movement, many Kashmiri networks that are kind of like creating a solidarity in the international community. At the same time, like writing or scholar activists, they actually lumped my work into terrorism aiding and abetting Islamic terrorism because I was not mentioning that someone was not a Muslim. I don't want to go into that article too much, but the lazy nationalism that takes every image and lumps it as this is an Islamic terrorist. So even when I'm talking in the idiom that I am, and even when I'm trying to bring different aspects of how Kashmir should be looked at, it's very easy for anyone to come and criticize it as, oh, you know, they're not talking about this, so they're actually aiding and abetting Islamic terrorism, which is such a misnomer. Like, what is Islamic terrorism? How can it even be used as a valid term? And how can something and how can it be bought by people who are just rational people wanting to have an opinion, looking for some more knowledge, but they're also buying into this. So I think there's so much fear that has been created. And when a nation feels, when you define borders and when you are holding on to the borders, this inflammation of borders that India has, if you look at from Arunachal Pradesh, you look at Assam, and then you're looking towards south. I mean, south is not restful. There's huge issues there. And even with, but they're very pragmatic down there. And this geo body that has been put together in 1947, it's like it's being held together by fear. I mean, there was a time when there were very discreet politicians, like a Congress politician recently said, what BJP did so brazenly, we have done 12 times so far, and no one really has come to know, because that's what they have used. They have used the courts. They used what in our work we call legal annexation. And by legal, we don't mean that it's legal. By legal, we mean that they have used courts to do what they did inside Kashmir, to change laws, so that people didn't even realize that in the 1960s, from having a president and a prime minister inside Kashmir, suddenly there was a chief minister and a governor. And Kashmiris protested for the longest time. What's happening now has happened in every phase in Kashmir. It's not a new thing. But still, they used they used aggression, but they also used an indirect aggression so that it didn't look like a military chadhai. What happened on August 5th was a brazen, outright re-annexation of Kashmir. It was a chadhai of all means. You put people inside, and then you get 48,000 more troops on top of the 700,000 that are already there. What are the people going to think? I mean, just think about them. They're going to, like, we're bringing development to you while we're doing all of this to you. So I don't know how Indians are thinking at the moment, but I feel like it's a fearful population. They're fearing for their borders more than they're fearing for their themselves and their conscience and whatever the religion that they're holding dear, hold dear. I feel like they're thinking about this imaginary community of the nationalistic borders and all of that, but they don't really see the people. Is this really valid? Is this how they have to contribute to what they're holding on to? And I think it's the worst way that they can contribute to their society and to the nation state is by being lazy nationalists and buying into this fact that everyone has to be held together. You have to drive fear into these communities and telling them, if you're not like us, then you're not us. And if you're not us, then we're going to annihilate you, clean this territory, which is what Kashmiris fear at the moment. And then people it with our own people. And then, you know, and I think someone was asking about resource extraction. Like, what's the resource extraction? I'll give you one example. Sand. It's one of the most trivial things that we think in the rivers, around the seas. So sand extraction was one of the biggest trades that is happening in and around Kashmir, because there are many rivers. And of course, like, local people, local contractors are should have a say in that. And they have been doing the sand extraction because building is taking place. Construction needs sand. But the moment August 5th happened, there is no internet. So what happens is that the government issues, they call in for the sand extraction. And they call it through, it's an online contract, and people have to apply to it online. But there is no internet inside Kashmir, so who is going to apply? Now that Kashmir has been opened to the Indian masses, So you actually have
Yeah.
contractors from outside coming in and getting these contracts at different rates, while the local contractors,
Yeah.
they have no contract. Or even if they're getting a contract, like how can they even apply because they don't have internet? Think about it. What
Yeah.
are Kashmiris going to think about? And now it's not just the army coming in, it's not just the politicians coming in. Now imagine it's going to be local Indians from different states coming in, and they're going to be pitting themselves against local Kashmiris. So who is the enemy now? Earlier, there was this face
Yeah.
of an army man. It's a very terrible thing happening with Indians as well, and they should think about this. That earlier, if there was a soldier, there's one soldier for every 8 Kashmiris, where there is one doctor for to the tune of 3,000 and more Kashmiris. But now, when you're sending these businessmen, and these are not regular businessmen, who goes and does business in a violent situation where people are demanding that they be heard? There is regular resistance, there is armed resistance. Who are these people who are going to go and do business there? These have got to be some committed people who have bought into the lazy nationalism that has been sold to them, that's full of fear, and that's also very, very nationalistic in the terms that, oh, you know, this is ours and we have to take it. So these people are not going to be easy civilians coming in. They are going to be settlers. They are going to be settler colonialism, just like Israelis, that they are going to be seen in that way. And it's and think about this. Think about the dangerous situations it's going to create for people who are coming in. And even if someone comes to visit. So it's a tinderbox upon a tinderbox upon a tinderbox. And I feel like at this moment, the way India is going, there's not much thought into what is being created inside Kashmir. Because what they are being told is that this is our land and it's being taken away by Pakistan, but that's not the truth. It's the laziest nationalism, the laziest nationalist, and not just nationalist, but ethno-religious nationalism that is being sold to Indians.
Yeah. There's a question that's repeated by several people about how has the Kashmiri Pandit narrative been weaponized in the Indian discourse of Kashmir. And I think this is probably every conversation around Kashmir somehow ends up passing by the Kashmiri Pandit question, but this is probably a question that's framed in a
it's framed in a different manner, because there's a stereotypical question like, what about Pandits? And I'm not saying I think, you know, when you think about Kashmiri indigeneity, think about these are two peoples who come from the same stock, and they were torn asunder in the last 72 years in different manners. And there have been Kashmiri Pandits who were for joining Pakistan, because they thought that they thought that was the logic of partition, that Muslim majorities go towards Pakistan and Hindu majorities go towards India, even though India called itself secular, but was nominally secular. It was a Hindu majority nation. So then there was a section of Pandits who were pro-India. And when I say section, many of them. And of course, then there are people who are just regular people who live their lives and who don't do active politics, but they do subscribe to the larger narrative of the community. But by and large, these two communities held together because they came from the same historic lineage, in that sense, same ethnic lineage. And there was a huge power differential between them. The Pandits, many of them were elites, and not to say that there was not poverty in the community, but they were also caste elites, not just the class elites. They were also caste elites, and most of them were caste elites. Even if they didn't have all of them had the monetary capital, but all of them had the social capital to be the caste elites that they were. So there already existed a huge power differential between the two communities. The Muslim community was the subservient community, the unlettered community, the indentured community. So you have that tinderbox already happening under British rule and under British paramountcy. And the Dogra rule was already a Hindu rule, where Muslims were indentured. So you already have that tinderbox. And then 1947 happens, and many pundits subscribe to the idea of India because naturally they're Hindus, and even if they had a different kind of a denomination, but by and large, by now, what's happened is that they are indistinguishable in the religion aspect. Otherwise, from what my experiential, my lived experience was a different kind of Hinduism that I had seen till 1989. So the weaponization that has happened, I think, tearing these two communities asunder, so they had a visible social contract that they went by. But after 1947, as Muslims, not just 1947, even under Dogra rule, you had the Glancy Commission happening, where the British actually told the Dogra rule that, hey, look at the situation of Kashmiris. In 1931, 22 Kashmiris were killed by the monarchy as they were kind of demanding a sovereign democracy and demanding equal rights. They had been demanding that for the longest time. And Kashmiri Muslims were not allowed to do many things, which was also like trying to curb their freedom of expression and also curb their freedom of religion. They couldn't even have a pocket knife. They couldn't do a sacrifice without asking the royal officer. So there was a lot of power differential between the two communities, between the Hindu monarchy and, of course, the subjects, but then also the Pandits and the Muslims. And from 1947 onwards, as you have this narrative of the pro-India client politicians inside Kashmir, then you have a section that of Kashmiris who are siding with Pakistan, want to accede to Pakistan. Then you also have a section of Kashmiris, and majority of them, historic accounts lend to the fact that many of them were for independence, majority of them. Andrew Whitehead is one of the books that's really, his book, The Mission of Kashmir, it's very helpful in kind of understanding. And he has statistics as well, I think, on page 28, I remember, about that the majority of Kashmiri people were for sovereign democracy and having their own independent nation. So when you have these different, you have these three opinions happening, and Kashmiri Pandits, they were pro-India, and that kind of came to a rupture in 1989. And that rupture was used by the Indian state, because see here, who is the most powerful in this situation? Are the militants powerful in this situation? Is quote-unquote Pakistan powerful in this situation? But when you have a hold on a certain territory, when you have your soldiers inside a territory, you have client politicians working for you, who is the most responsible for managing, controlling, handling that region? So this already present rupture was used to instill fear in both the communities. There was already a fear of each other. So, you know, when you look at a snake, you think the snake thinks the snake is fearful of the human and the human is fearful of the snake. I'm not making analogies here. I'm just giving the analogy of fear, that we fear the other fears us. So that's what was created. That was the power differential was already present in the two communities, Hindus and Muslims. They also had a social contract where they were kind of like working with each other. There was also a historicity that they came from the same ethnic stock in a way, but then there was a casteist class differential as well. So I have personally, I'm writing a piece with my Hindu Pandit scholars, and we have an issue coming out somewhere in the next year where we talk about these lived experiences. We talk about how I was as a Kashmiri Muslim and how a Hindu Pandit household was, and how did we are trying to create this narrative that not everything was okay, but there was a social contract that had been built where each of the communities was living sort of in a silo, but then they were also coming together in some ways. And then the weaponization.
This IGT, this video is going to get over. I'm just waiting for more people to join in, and Ather will join in.
Hi.
Hello. Sorry, for those of you who have just joined us, this is actually part 2 of the conversation that we were having as a culminating conversation with Ather Zia, who did a takeover of the Conflictorium handle. So if you've come to this video before you have seen part 1, please go to video part 1 and then come to this conversation. Ather, there were many people who were, while we were trying to do this again, and I was scrolling up through the comments, and everyone was very, very eager that this gets saved and it's put up. And I just want to share with everybody that it has been saved and it's already up on IGTV. And that if other people have questions, they should feel free to put it in the comment, and we'll try and take as many, although we need to start sort of wrapping up this conversation in maybe about 15 minutes. Yeah.
So I was talking about there was already a power differential between the communities, and there was also political differences between the communities, large political differences. And I think in 1989, as I earlier laid out, that the state here was the most powerful entity. They have authority over everything. They have authority over. So there are the militants, of course, and then the fear that is already present in the two communities that was built to an extent. And you have scholars telling you that what happened in 1989, the community that Muslims usually do, it's around the mosque, it's around the masjid, because that's where you have the loudspeakers. That's where many of the people can already organically congregate. So there was that element to the Kashmiri movement, or Tehreek as it is called in Kashmiri. Kashmiri people call their movement as Tehreek. That's the word for it. And I think that's another thing that Indians should start thinking about. Like, what do they call this movement? Do they call it by Atankwad? No, they don't call it Atankwad. Do they call it terrorism? No, they don't call it terrorism. They call it a Tehreek, whether that be armed or that be everyday resistance, or unarmed resistance, or political resistance. So that's 1989 for you, where the power differential, the differences between the two communities that really came handy for the state, in my view, primarily for the state, to kind of tear them asunder. And when you create a communal kind of a conflagration, it's easy to sell it to the rest of the world. And for that, both Kashmiris, like these are Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims, for lack of a better analogy, they're part of the same body. And they're part of the same indigeneity. And they have shared histories. Even if whatever the power differential, through different generations, and whatever the differences, whatever different influences and lineages and whatever they have had, with all that, I think they had a shared legacy, and that was torn asunder in 1989. And how is it that this kind of happens overnight? It doesn't. So I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, like what had been brewing till that point in time between the two communities. And I think we as scholars are going back. We are trying to look at it critically, rather than we don't want to lend to the nationalist narrative of anyone, but we want to speak about ground voices on Kashmir that have been talking about this, both Muslims and both Pandits, and also talk about different people who have lent to this narrative, the narrative of independence inside Kashmir, the narrative of Pakistan, Kashmir becoming Pakistan, so to speak, inside Kashmir, and thinking about that all communities and all societies and all people, they have different kinds of opinions, but they come together towards the end for a majority decision, just like India came together for a certain decision, despite having differences under British India, despite fighting differently, British India, despite co-opting with British India differently. They came together like that. It was a decade long, or maybe more than negotiation of what India would become, what would be its borders, who would be the people who would join it. And that's why you have Kashmir, that's why you have what's happening, for lack of a better word, in the Northeast. And that's what you have, the issues in heartland Kashmir. This is something trying to come together. And to me, such large nation states, they don't hold. And I think the world, we really have to think about, as we are coming towards, so thinking about weaponization, let me answer that question. So that difference was really weaponized by India. And I think it was sharpened by BJP, but it was, whatever government was there, it was weaponized by them. Then it was sharpened by each of the governments that came in. As a result, today, when people think about Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Pandits, they think of themselves as hugely different entities, when in reality, it's a tragedy of both communities, of what's happened to them. So I feel like that's something that I don't know how it can be repaired, whether it can be repaired, because now with the change in domicile law, the rightful citizens of Kashmir, the Kashmiri Pandits, it's almost like the 370 is gone, they can come back. But that's not true. It's not right to come back. No one can give them the right to come back. They have the right to come back because they are its people. So when this hashtag was becoming, I don't know if it was becoming popular, but it did come through my purview that the right to go back, like 370 gives you the right. It doesn't give you the right to go back. You can already go back. You are not a settler colonial. Yeah. But what India is doing by trying to think about segregated cantonments for these people, by segregated neighborhoods, it is creating a certain ghettoization and a certain element of settler colonialism to this community as well, which is not a settler colonial community. But the way it's being portrayed, as if 370 paved a way for them to go back, as if going away of 370 created some sort of security. No, it did not. And I feel like that's again creating a tinderbox upon a tinderbox, and that's going to be a more conflagrant situation in the future. And then who is going to be blamed? That's also a question. Like, who is going to be blamed for anything that is potential in this tinderbox? Any potential, and that's not good for Kashmiri Muslims. And I feel like no one will think about it at the moment. So that's the weaponization, and that's what Kashmiris fear. I feel like we have to come face to face with our history. We have to come face to face with who we are as a people, and what shortcomings were there in the 1989 or 1991, and we have to overcome them. We have to, and I'm not talking about truth and reconciliation. It doesn't happen till the dispute is over. It doesn't happen till people determine their rights and they determine their future. But what I'm talking about as we go along, these are also parallel thoughts that should be thought by people in both the communities. And I feel like I want to introduce you to a group of scholars all across the globe who call themselves Critical Kashmir Studies Scholars. And we have a collective of a sort that we have formed, but it's not all of those people. We have allies, and we're trying to bring everyone together. But we are thinking about these questions. We are coming together as Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims, and even thinking about Sikh scholars and other scholars who want to come in, even if they're not subscribing to any religion, but thinking about Kashmir in a much more emancipated way, not just putting ourselves in the box of nationalistic desires and then making our narratives fit that. So everything in Kashmir is being weaponized at the moment. Even the word normalcy is weaponized. India tells us that everything is normal inside Kashmir. We hate the word normal now. We hate the word integration. Everyone thinks integration is such a good word, but for Kashmiris, it means only violence. So everything that can be weaponized is being weaponized by India. And most unfortunate is the Kashmiri Muslim and Kashmiri Pandit, the differential that was already present in the two communities. It was exploited to hilt. As a result, now we see them as adversary communities. And I'm not saying that, again, I want to repeat, there was a history there. There was a caste difference there. And that has to be kept in mind before we... And then the other word that is always used is the word Kashmiriyat. Kashmiris don't really see that. That was something that it's not a Kashmiri word. We don't... it's mostly an Urdu word that was transported, that emerged within the Indian client politician narrative, not the... If Kashmiris would have used this word historically, they would have used the word Kashrut. They wouldn't have used Kashmiriyat. So that's something to think about, that not everything was good between the two communities. There already were many, many differences, but that were exploited. You know, if we had let emancipatory elements flourish, because there were emancipatory elements in both the communities. There were Kashmiri Pandits who, even the last one of the prime ministers, Ramchandra Kak, who was for Pakistan accession, Raghunath Vaishnavi. These were people who had who were for sovereign democracy. They were seeing a different kind of future for Kashmir, and they were pundits. If that kind of section would have flourished without the patronage of India, and that kind of section would have flourished within the Kashmiri Muslims without any other, intervention from India, we would have had a different story to tell today. But what was on the contrary, what was actually propagated was the divisive elements. They were built upon, and it wasn't just 1989. It was way before then. These divides were built upon, and at the same time, education, the rates of education were increasing in Kashmiri Muslims as well. They were also kind of reckoning with their history, and then you have what you have at this present moment. That's on one hand you have this weaponization, but on the other hand you have people who are thinking about questions that we have to reckon and realities that we have to come face to face with without thinking we are any lesser people. Societies make mistakes all the time, and what we need to do is just come face to face with those mistakes. And by mistake I mean when we choose not to meet our histories, when we choose to think, oh, there was Kashmiriyat before and that Kashmiriyat is gone after 1989. No, that's not the truth. That is not the truth. We have to come to face with the differences that we were dealing with, the power differentials that we were dealing with, which India actually built upon the divisiveness that it was able to cash in 1989 and even now at this present moment.
Yeah. As a concluding question, and I know it's a really difficult question to answer or to think through, and maybe it is our job as Indians to think about it, but I'm still asking you about it. What would justice or what would utopia, not even utopia, what would justice look like if it had a shape that we want to see?
I feel like there's so many ways that justice can unfold, or maybe ideally, like we can have so many different ways we can put the sentence together if it's a matter of vocabulary after everything is said and done. But I feel like if we have to think about Kashmir as a place which is going to lend not just the region, but I feel it's a place where a creative solution can be deployed, and justice for Kashmiris is going to, not just Kashmiris, but the entire region. The entire region is battered. The Kashmiris might be the most battered, but the entire region, it's been brutalized in different ways by direct and indirect aggression for the last 72 years, and even before that. So demilitarize the area and decolonize the area. Stop what has been happening aggressively after August 5th. I think at this moment, as people are kind of seeking the domicile of Kashmir, of Jammu and Kashmir, Indians should question those Indians. Like, why are you going to Kashmir? Why are you going to live there? And I'm not saying that it's not a great place to live. It's a beautiful place to live and die. That's what I hope for myself. But the fact is, like, I feel like if this person, this IS officer from Bihar, who just sought the state subject of Kashmir, and maybe he's been living there for 20 years, working there for 20 years, but he should be asked by other people in Bihar, like, why are you going there? Why are you giving up Bihar? And how are Kashmiris going to look at you? How are the blinded people going to look at you? How are the people who are losing properties every day going to look at you? How are the people who are the street fighters going to look at you? How are the dogs of Kashmir going to look at you? Who are you for all of these people? And if you are going thinking that people are thinking these thoughts about you, you are going not as a civilian, you are going as a soldier of the Indian nation. And I feel like that's the question that we should be kind of like keeping in mind. And justice for Kashmiris looks like putting a stop to the active settler colonialism that has been put into the motion for, and when I say active, I mean the removal of 35A, which has given free hand to anyone who can come inside Kashmir. And it's not the poor people of India who are going to go and live in Kashmir. They can buy land there. And I'm not saying that, I would all due respect to poor people everywhere, financially disadvantaged people everywhere, but they can't be living in Kashmir. They can't be buying the real estate. So who is going there? Who are going to be facilitated? Are these people going to be civilians? Are these going to be soldiers? I feel like they are going to be soldiers in a civilian garb. And justice looks like that. Justice looks like the first is to put a stop to the settler colonialism, the policies, have an active movement around that, if it's possible, demilitarize the entire region, decolonize the entire region, and then put into motion what was already promised in 1947, which is the right to self-determination, and whatever that might look like for the people. And then have a negotiation on it, but give the region a rest, take the military out, deoccupy the region.
No, I haven't ever been able to say this in these many words, and I don't in any way claim to represent the Indian people at all. But in whatever capacity, I want to actually apologize, and apologize on behalf of the kind of violence across decades that your people have endured. And
well, it's a very thoughtful gesture, but at the same time, I feel like as we think of this as something very personal and something very intimate, at the same time, you cannot be held responsible for an imaginary, a lazy nationalism. If we are talking in this manner, I feel like these are the little islands that we create, islands of solidarity, and they can also grow bigger. They can grow bigger. They have every potential to grow bigger, which is why I feel like if in 1947 there was a Pandit community, there was section of Pandits, section of Muslims, if they had been allowed to flourish as to what kind of future you want for yourself, where every element is accommodated, where not just accommodated, but accepted, not just tolerated, but accepted. So what kind of future would we have? And if the divisive elements were not allowed to build on our differences and build for the longest time, 72 years is a long time, which is why you see people from the same stock. You can't really distinguish a Kashmiri Pandit face from a Kashmiri Muslim face. They look the same. And to me, it's the greatest tragedy of what can happen to a region, what can happen to, even with all the misgivings, with all the differences. Because, as people become more emancipated, as people move beyond borders, as people move transcontinentally, we see different, today we have a solidarity with Standing Rock. We have a solidarity with Indigenous people in Australia. We are seeing the brutalization of Indigenous people. So that's what Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims are. Indigenous people who have been brutalized in their own way, whose differences have been built upon till they became these enemies. They're not enemies of each other. And I feel like that kind of, and I don't want to say I accept your apology, because we are, there's no apologies here. If there is understanding, we need compassion. We need to accept each other's realities and accept the fact. I mean, the reason I love anthropology is because it talks about people as cultures. It talks about people as peoples. And that's the kind of visions. Kashmir and situations like Kashmir all across the world, they are creative, generative places where we can think beyond nation states. I'm not saying the European Union is what is the ideal. They have their own problems, but they were able to overcome what they did in World War II and World War I. If they can do it, this region can do it too. With due respect to all peoples, all languages. Today, we are very worried about Kashmiri language. I mean, when Kashmiri water becomes jal, Tresh becomes pani, becomes jal, Hindi might be a beautiful language. I find Hindi beautiful, but suddenly it's adversarial because now it's being imposed upon you. Hindi was my third language. I studied it with gusto, and I think in my class, one of my teachers, she was like, "Oh, you pick up languages so well." And I loved writing in Hindi because to me it seemed very methodical. It was like you had all these lines and then you had to hang everything from the line. To me, that was like, oh, you're creating so much order. You already have something to hang on to. But now, when suddenly the names of the departments, water department is being changed, the names in Kashmir are being changed from even whatever they were, whether we agreed with them or not, because, you know, but now everything is becoming Hindi, and suddenly this is being introduced as a colonial imposition. What are you going to do with that language? Rather than thinking anthropologically as peoples, as cultures, you're going to be like, no, 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 we don't want to learn Hindi. Urdu and Kashmiri should be, and suddenly you're becoming for something and against something. But to think that someone is pitting you against it, you are not like that. Kashmiris were choosing to learn Hindi. Kashmiris were choosing to learn Persian. Kashmiris were choosing to learn English because, you know, English is imposed upon us. We are not human beings till we learn English. I think that's the post-colonial reality of the entire world. Sad to say. But, and this conversation is also happening in English because there is a sure chance that everyone will understand it. And that's a post-colonial reality that we all share. And it's a tragedy too. But thinking about language imposition at the moment and thinking about the kind of changes that are being done, there are, to me, it's like a tinderbox within a tinderbox within a tinderbox. And that's not a good situation at all. And my fear is that in all of this, the Kashmiri is being constructed as a super enemy. And even at the moment, if they're silenced, there's not going to be silence for the long time. And silence in the sense that the militants are still active in whatever capacity that they can be. And to Kashmiris, they are fighting for their cause. And that Indians need to come face to face with, whether they're for Pakistan or not, whether majority of Kashmiris are for independence or not. But these fighters are seen as mujahids. They're seen as fighters, and they're called, for that lack of a neutral term, they're called as militants and not as terrorists. They're called as mujahids. They're called as, if they're coming from elsewhere, they're called mehman mujahids. They're called guest mujahids. They're not called infiltrators. They're not called foreign militants. They're called mehman mujahid, that we have asked them to come. So these are vocabularies that Indians need to. I think that's also something that needs to happen. That these words need to go into circulation, and we have done this in our work. And if that is read somewhere in India, yeah.
Thank you, Ather, for really opening this up. And whereas actually it is our labor that it is meant, we are supposed to be putting in this labor to teach ourselves and to open our minds and teach ourselves criticality. But thank you for actually opening this.
Thank you so much. It wouldn't have happened. This platform wouldn't have opened to me if you hadn't opened your heart. So you opened your hearts, and I just took it over, and I felt like what I needed to do was, this is such a crucial moment for Kashmiris when they're losing their identity, losing in the sense that it's being removed from them. They're not letting it go. And these are people, many of them are on ground. Many of them, if this was to be read by the Indian government seriously, if these platforms were taken as seriously, many of them would be under Public Safety Act tomorrow. I'm here in the privilege of West. I'm here in a silo of the academia. I'm vastly privileged from, and it was easy for me to take over and do this. But I know it's not easy for them to say it while they are on ground, while people are being arrested, detained, mauled, humiliated, killed for saying the same thing. So hats off to them and to their bravery. And this, your audience should know that it's very hard for them to say this. I won't name her, but saying being a Kashmiri means living constantly in state of uncertainty, routinely experiencing violence under occupation, dealing with lies of the occupier, and striving to establish the truth, for keeping resistance alive and being hopeful for freedom. This is being said, it's on your site. It's being said by someone who is actually in Kashmir at the moment. And she is saying this at the cost of her life and safety. But she said it, and she sent this to me, and I put it out there. And I feel like that's a reality that Indians have to contend with. How much danger there is inside just to say that they are Kashmiris. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
I think
you. Be well. Stay safe.
Yeah, you too. You too. And for a shared vision of a more equal, more free, more just world.
Yeah, a decolonized world.
A decolonized.
Yeah, truly decolonized. Thank you.